The whistle of the westbound train echoed through the narrow valley, scattering a flock of crows from the telegraph poles. When the smoke cleared, Clara May stepped down onto the platform, a worn carpetbag in her hand and hope trembling in her chest. She had come a long way from St. Louis, traveling for days with nothing but a letter promising marriage, a home, and perhaps a future. But the moment her boots touched the cracked wooden planks, she could feel it, the weight of curious eyes. The kind that measured and judged Clara was not what most men pictured when they imagined a mail-order bride. She was tall and broad-shouldered, with strong hands from years of farm work and curves that her corset could never quite hide. Her auburn hair framed a face too sun-kissed to be fashionable and eyes too soft to fight back against the world's cruelty. She had always known she was different, but she believed love would look past that. A man in a gray hat approached, Mr. Willis, the one who had written to her. He scanned her from head to toe, his expression faltering like a candle caught in the wind. "You're Miss Clara May?" he asked. "Yes, sir," she said, forcing a smile, her heart fluttering with relief. "I came as you asked. I'm ready to start our life together," but his smile didn't reach his eyes. I think there's been a misunderstanding," he stammered, tugging at his collar. "You didn't quite look like your picture." He mumbled a few excuses about his mother's illness, about timing, about not being ready, and just like that, he tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Clara standing alone as the wind tugged at her skirt. By nightfall, the entire town knew about the bride who'd been sent back. The boarding-house matron, Mrs. Turner, offered her a room and a plate of stew, but her eyes carried pity, the kind that burned more than kindness. In the days that followed, Clara endured the whispers men glanced her way only to look off just as quickly. Women spoke softly behind their hands, saying things like, "Bless her heart, she must be desperate," or, "Maybe there's a reason no one wants her." Each morning, she went to the post office, hoping for a letter. Another chance, but none came. Her savings dwindled. Her hope thinned. She tried to be useful, mending clothes for the laundress, helping Mrs. Turner in the kitchen, always smiling, always pretending she didn't hear the laughter. But at night, when the lamplight flickered across her small rented room, she would sit by the window and whisper to the darkness, "Maybe I was foolish to believe love could find me." Still, she couldn't bring herself to leave. Somewhere deep down, she believed the West had something left for her, something different from the rejection and scorn she'd always known. One late afternoon, after yet another lonely trip to the general store, Clara paused on the wooden steps, arms full of flour and candles. The sun dipped behind the pine ridge, casting long shadows across the street. As she looked up, her gaze caught a figure in the distance, a man taller than any she'd ever seen, broad and steady, his flannel shirt streaked with sawdust. He stood by his wagon, speaking softly to a horse that seemed far too gentle for such a giant. He glanced her way, not with pity or ridicule, but with quiet curiosity. Their eyes met for only a second, yet something stirred in Clara's chest, something fragile but alive. She quickly looked away, heart pounding, but for the first time since she'd arrived, she didn't feel invisible. The townsfolk might see her as the bride no one wanted, but somewhere in the shadows of the pine woods, a man named Samuel Holt had seen her differently, and though she didn't know it yet, that fleeting moment would change both of their lives forever. The forests outside, Pine Hollow stretched for miles, thick with towering pines. Cool streams and the low hum of saws from men who worked the timber trade. Among them was Samuel Holt, a man as quiet as the woods themselves. He lived alone in a cabin at the edge of the ridge, where the air was sharper and the world felt far away from the gossip and noise of town. Samuel had always been a man of strength. His shoulders were broad, his hands calloused, and his frame seemed to move trees more easily than most men swung an axe. Yet behind his sighs lay a gentleness few had ever seen. Years ago, before he'd retreated into solitude, he had loved once, a woman from the town who'd promised forever, only to leave when she realized the lumberjack's world was one of mud, silence, and hard work. The heartbreak had settled deep in his bones, and since then, Samuel found peace only in the rhythm of chopping wood and the company of his horse, Boone. He rarely came into Pine Hollow except to trade lumber or buy supplies. That was how he first saw her, the mail-order bride who didn't quite fit the town's narrow mold. He noticed her at the market one chilly morning, standing near the general store with a basket of bread in her arms. The townsfolk barely looked at her, but Samuel couldn't take his eyes off the way she held herself, proud but trembling, as if she was trying to shrink from the world's cruelty while still standing tall. He overheard two men laughing near the hitching post. Poor fellow dodged a bullet. One snickered. Imagine waking up next to that every morning. The other chuckled cruelly, and Samuel felt a slow burn rise in his chest. He didn't know the woman, didn't even know her name, but something in him tightened. That deep, protective instinct he thought had died years ago that night. While the rain drummed on his cabin roof, he found himself thinking about her. He pictured her face, the quiet sadness in her eyes, and the way she had stood alone against the tide of whispers. He wondered what kind of courage it took to travel across the country, only to be rejected before she could even unpack her hopes. He respected that kind of bravery, the kind born from pain, not pride. A week later, a storm rolled down from the mountains, fierce and unrelenting. The wind howled through the trees, tearing shingles from roofs and flooding the roads into town. Samuel rode down the ridge to check on supplies and saw smoke curling from the boarding house chimney, not the kind of smoke that spoke of warmth, but the dark, angry kind that spelled trouble. He spurred Boone forward. The chimney had collapsed in the wind, setting part of the roof ablaze. People scrambled to throw water from buckets, but the storm's fury made it almost impossible in the chaos. He saw her, Clara May, standing barefoot in the mud, clutching a trunk to her chest while rain soaked her hair. Her face was pale, her lips trembling. Without hesitation, Samuel jumped from his horse and pushed through the crowd. "Miss, come with me," he said, his deep voice steady even against the roar of the storm. She blinked at him, startled. She didn't even know his name, but there was something in his eyes that made her trust him instantly. Lifted her trunk as though it weighed nothing and guided her to his wagon. "You'll catch your death out here," he said gruffly, pulling his coat around her shoulders when she hesitated. He added quietly, "Just until the storm passes." And so, the woman who had been turned away by every man in town rode away into the storm with the quiet lumberjack from the woods. The wheels of his wagon cut deep tracks through the muddy road, two paths leading toward something neither of them yet understood that night. When they reached his cabin and he lit the fire, Clara realized it was the first time since her arrival that she truly felt safe. And though Samuel didn't say much, he felt something stir in his chest, a warmth he hadn't felt in years, flickering to life in the glow of the hearth. He didn't know it yet, but that storm had done more than tear down a chimney. It had broken down the walls around two lonely hearts, setting them on a path toward something far greater than either had dared hope for. The storm raged through the night, but inside Samuel Holt's cabin, the world felt still. The fire crackled softly, sending waves of warmth across the single-room home. Clara sat near the hearth, her damp dress now replaced with a woolen blanket Samuel had given her. The scent of pine and smoke filled the air, mingled with the faint aroma of coffee simmering on the stove. It had been a long time since she had felt safe, truly safe, and though this cabin was humble, it felt like a sanctuary. Samuel moved quietly, his large frame somehow gentle as he placed another log on the fire. He was a man of few words, and silence didn't bother him. Yet, tonight felt different. The presence of another soul, especially one so delicate yet so strong, stirred something deep within him. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need," he said finally, his voice low and calm. "Till the boarding house is repaired." Clara looked up from her cup of coffee, her fingers trembling slightly. "You've already done more than anyone else ever has. I don't want to be a burden." He shook his head. "You're not." Those two words lingered in the air longer than any promise could. Clara smiled faintly. Though her eyes were glassy with emotion, it had been a long while since anyone had looked at her without judgment over the next few days. The storm passed, leaving the woods glistening under a blanket of mist. The world outside was wet and cold, but inside Samuel's cabin, warmth bloomed in quiet, unexpected ways. Clara helped tidy the place, sweeping the floor, washing dishes, and mending the torn curtains with careful stitches. Samuel, in turn, split extra firewood, repaired the porch railing, and ensured she had everything she needed. Though they spoke little at first, comfort grew between them. In the evenings, Samuel would sit by the fire, carving small wooden figures while Clara read aloud from the Bible or an old poetry book she had carried from home. Her voice was soft but steady, filling the cabin with a kind of peace he hadn't known he missed. Sometimes he caught himself watching her, the way her hair shimmered in the firelight, the quiet determination in her hands as she worked. She was unlike anyone he'd ever known. The women in town were delicate and distant. Clara was real, steady, and unafraid of hard work. She didn't flinch at mud on her hem or the roughness of his voice, and though she had faced cruelty, she carried herself with a grace that humbled him. One morning, as Samuel was hauling water from the well, he found Clara outside, sleeves rolled up, tending to his small vegetable patch. She was humming softly, her cheeks flushed with the morning chill. For a moment, he simply watched, the way the light touched her face, the calm purpose in her movements. It struck him then how naturally she belonged there. "You didn't have to do that," he said when she noticed him. She smiled, brushing dirt from her hands. "I know, but it feels good to do something useful again." He nodded, unable to say more. Words had never been his strength, but in that instant, he felt something shift. A quiet knowing that this woman had brought warmth back into his cold, quiet life that evening. As they shared supper, simple bread and stew, Clara looked around the cabin and whispered, "This place feels peaceful, like it's holding its breath." Samuel looked up from his bowl. "It's been quiet a long time," he said then, softer, almost to himself. "I guess it was waiting for the right company." Clara's heart fluttered at his words. She didn't reply, but the small, tender smile on her lips said everything. As night settled over the forest, the wind carried the scent of pine through the cracks of the cabin. Inside, two lonely souls, one gentle, one weary, began to find something neither had expected: healing. The silence between them no longer felt empty, but alive, filled with the first sparks of something that might just become love. Spring arrived in Pine Hollow with the scent of wet earth and the hum of new life. The snow melted from the ridges, and the town slowly stirred from its winter slumber. For Clara and Samuel, the long months of isolation in the cabin had changed everything. What began as a refuge had grown into something deeper. A quiet partnership filled with unspoken affection and mutual respect. Samuel found himself smiling more often, his laughter echoing through the woods as he worked. Clara, in turn, seemed lighter, her eyes brighter and her step surer. Together, they built small comforts: a new quilt, a rocking chair Samuel carved by hand, and a garden they tended side by side. It was a simple life, but to Clara, it was the first time she felt like she belonged somewhere yet beyond the woods. The world had not changed so kindly when Clara returned to town for the first time since the storm. She felt the shift immediately. Whispers followed her like a shadow. Women paused their gossip as she passed. Men looked her way with smirks that carried both curiosity and judgment. The story of the oversized, mail-order bride hadn't faded. It had grown. Now people said she was living with the lumberjack in the woods without a preacher's blessing. At the general store, Mrs. Whitby, the shopkeeper's wife, gave Clara a tight-lipped smile. "You've been gone a while, dear. Heard you found company." Her tone dripped with condescension. Clara forced a polite nod. "Mr. Holt was kind enough to offer shelter when the boarding house burned." Mrs. Whitby's eyebrow arched. "Kind, was he? Well, I do hope the arrangement remains respectable." The word stung more than Clara wanted to admit. She finished her shopping quickly, but as she stepped outside, she caught sight of two young men laughing near the stables. One of them nudged the other and said loud enough for her to hear, "Guess she found someone big enough to handle her." Their laughter rang through the street. Clara froze, humiliation washing over her like cold rain. For a moment, she thought about turning back toward the woods and never returning. But she held her head high, though her eyes burned. She walked away, each step heavier than the last. When she reached the cabin, Samuel was splitting wood by the fence. He noticed her silence before she even spoke. "Something happened in town?" he asked, wiping sweat from his brow. She hesitated, then forced a weak smile. "Nothing that hasn't happened before." Samuel frowned. "Tell me." She shook her head. "It doesn't matter, I'm used to it." But later that night, as the fire flickered low, she broke. "They think I'm shameful," she whispered. "That I trapped you somehow, that no man could truly want a woman like me." Her voice cracked as tears welled in her eyes. "Maybe they're right." Samuel set down his cup, his jaw tightening. He had seen cruelty before, but hearing it aimed at her, the gentlest soul he had ever known, made his blood boil. Without a word, he stood, grabbed his coat, and left the cabin. When he returned an hour later, his eyes were still fierce. Though his voice was steady, "I went into town," he said simply, "and I told him the truth." Clara blinked. "The truth?" He stepped closer. "That you're the finest woman I've ever met. That no man in that town has half your strength, half your kindness, or half your heart, and that if they've got something to say about the woman I love, they can say it to my face." Her breath caught. "The woman I love." The words hung in the air like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Samuel," she began. But he silenced her gently, his calloused hand brushing her cheek. "Let them talk, Clara. The only thing that matters is what's real between us." She leaned into his touch, her tears softening into a smile. For the first time, the sting of cruel words no longer pierced her heart. Samuel's voice, steady and sure, became her shelter outside. The wind rustled through the pine trees, carrying away the last of the town's whispers. Inside, a deeper truth took root. That love, once found, is not easily broken by the smallness of other hearts. After that day, the town's whispers faded into the distance. Replaced by the steady rhythm of life in the woods, Samuel and Clara no longer cared about Pine Hollow's gossip. Their world existed beyond it, framed by tall pines, the laughter of running water, and the creak of the cabin's porch as they built something new together, a home. It began with small changes. Samuel cleared the patch of land behind the cabin so Clara could plant her garden. He fenced in a small chicken coop and built her a wash station near the stream. She filled the house with life, flowers in tin mugs, curtains she sewed by hand, and the scent of fresh bread that often drifted through the trees. Clara's laughter, once so rare, began to fill the cabin like sunlight through dusty windows. Samuel found himself smiling more easily, the tension in his shoulders easing each day. For years he had lived in quiet solitude, believing his heart was too scarred to love again. But now he would pause at the door each evening, just to listen to her humming, a soft tune that reminded him what peace sounded like. They worked side by side through the seasons. In spring they planted, In summer, they harvested. In fall, they chopped wood and preserved food for winter. Life was hard, yes, but shared hardship had a sweetness to it. They learned each other's silences, understood each other's moods without words. Samuel's rough hands, which once only knew labor, now brushed stray strands of hair from Clara's face with care. Clara, in turn, found in him a steadiness that no storm could shake still. The past lingered like a shadow sometimes. Clara's doubts would creep back in quiet moments, the memory of rejection, of cruel laughter, of being seen as less than enough. She would sometimes catch her reflection in the window and sigh. Her old insecurities whispering lies she thought she'd buried one evening as the sun dipped low behind the ridge. She stood by the garden fence, watching the chickens peck the dirt. Samuel came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her shoulders. "What's got you so quiet?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then murmured, "Sometimes I wonder if you ever wish you'd found someone else, someone finer. Someone the town would approve of." Samuel turned her to face him, his gaze steady. "I don't give a damn what the town approves of," he said softly. "I was alone for years because I didn't think love like this was real. You walked into my life and proved me wrong. You made this cabin a home. You made me a better man." Clara blinked back tears. "But I'm not." He silenced her with a finger to her lips. "You're everything," he said. "Exactly as you are." The conviction in his voice left no room for doubt. She rested her head against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear, the sound of a man who had chosen her freely, fully, without hesitation. Over time, the people of Pine Hollow began to see them differently. Clara's baking became known throughout town. Her pies, soft rolls, and preserves were soon requested by the same women who once mocked her. When she brought her goods to market, the shopkeepers greeted her warmly. Children smiled at her. Respect replaced gossip, though Clara no longer needed their approval. She had found her worth in simpler, truer things. Samuel, too, began to change in their eyes. The reclusive lumberjack became a familiar figure, the man who came into town not with a scowl, but with a quiet smile and a wife who walked proudly at his side. Together, they stood as living proof that love was not about appearance, but about the courage to see and be seen. One evening, as the sun spilled gold through the trees, Clara sat on the porch swing Samuel had built. He joined her, their hands finding each other naturally. The air was filled with the scent of pine and the distant hum of crickets. "I used to think love was something people like me weren't meant to have," Clara said softly. But now Samuel smiled, his thumb tracing gentle circles against her palm. "Now you know love's just something that finds the right heart, not the right size," she laughed quietly, leaning her head on his shoulder. The porch creaked beneath them, the forest swayed gently around them, and for the first time in both their lives, they knew what it meant to be home. Summer in Pine Hollow came like a soft sigh, warm winds through tall grass, the hum of bees in the garden, and golden light that lingered late into the evening. By now, months had passed since the storm that brought Clara into Samuel's life, yet she still caught herself wondering how such a twist of fate had turned loneliness into love. The cabin had changed too. Once cold and empty, it now felt alive, filled with laughter, music, and the smell of baked bread cooling by the window. Samuel had built a new table out of oak, and Clara had stitched their initials into a small patchwork quilt. Everything around them spoke of two lives slowly merging into one. But for Samuel, there was one thing left unsaid, one promise he had yet to make. He had never been a man of many words. Feelings for him lived in his actions, the wood he chopped, the meals he cooked, the way he brushed her hair from her eyes when she read by the fire. Yet every day, when he watched her moving through their home, he felt the quiet certainty that she was meant to stay, not as a guest, not as a companion, but as his wife still. Samuel worried, what if she no longer wanted that title? After all, the mail-order marriage she once dreamed of had brought her only pain. Would she see his proposal as another obligation rather than a choice? That thought lingered with him for days until, one golden evening, he finally decided. The sun was setting behind the ridge, the forest bathed in warm amber light. Clara was by the river, gathering wildflowers, her dress brushing softly through the grass. Samuel approached quietly, holding something in his hand, a small wooden ring carved from the heart of a pine tree. The grain swirled in delicate patterns, and though it wasn't perfect, it was honest like him. "Clara," he said softly. She turned, smiling. "You startled me. I didn't hear you come." He swallowed, his heart hammering. "I've been thinking about what you said once, about being unwanted, about feeling like no one ever saw you." Her smile faded slightly, her expression tender but uncertain. "I remember." Samuel stepped closer, the dying light framing his rugged face. "I can't promise riches or fancy things. All I've got is this cabin, these hands, and a heart that's yours if you'll have it." He held out the wooden ring, his voice thick with emotion. "You weren't meant to be anyone's mail-order bride. You were meant to be my choice, my home." Clara's breath caught for a moment. She couldn't speak. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at the ring, rough, simple, and beautiful in its sincerity. Then she looked at Samuel, the man who had seen her not as too much, not as too little, but as enough. "Samuel Holt," she whispered, voice trembling, "you've already given me more than I ever dreamed of." She took his rough hand in hers. "I don't need gold or fine promises. I just need you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, his touch gentle. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, the rustle of leaves, the murmur of the river, the distant song of birds. Then, with a soft laugh, Clara wrapped her arms around him, and he held her close, as if letting her go would undo everything that had made life worth living again. As the last rays of sunlight filtered through the pines, Samuel whispered against her hair, "You were never the bride no one wanted. Clara, you were just waiting for the right man to see you, right?" She smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "And you did." That night, the cabin glowed with lamplight, soft and golden. They sat by the fire, hands entwined, the ring catching the flicker of flame. Outside, the world was vast and wild, but inside, there was peace, the kind that comes from being truly seen and truly loved in the end. Love had not arrived in grand gestures or perfect beauty. It had come quietly, through kindness, patience, and courage. And as the gentle lumberjack and his once-rejected bride drifted into sleep, their hearts beat in harmony, a reminder that love isn't about finding perfection. It's about finding the one who sees perfection in you just as you are.